Among the flora and the fauna, beneath the branches who want to love ya, among the many souls who drive and lose control and stumble into a secret right under your nose.
Blessings, fellow weird and wild ones. My name's Goddess, aka G, aka your friendly neighborhood witch. They, them, their pronouns, please and thank you, point blank, period. Thank you for joining me in the practice of finding our way back to wholeness. This is our temple, our playground, our life, and our truths. During our audio session together, I will be talking with my village on how we are healing, changing paradigms, and decolonizing and degendering the mind. You are not alone. You are enough. Let's plant these divine seeds together. This work is for the collective from me, and there's a lot of magic that goes on behind the scenes. Find ways to support and reciprocate me and the other co-creators on the show at the links below. Grab your pens and paper, grab your woes, and let go.
Among the flora and the fauna, beneath the branches who wanna love ya.
Shout out and big thank you to a dear friend of mine, Lori Amadeo, for sharing her track Radiate Out with us. Check it out on the SoundCloud link below. Before we get into our session today, I would like to let the audience know that we will be talking about sexual acts, both wanted and unwanted. Also, Corey has a lot of amazing information. It goes above and beyond just the basics of consent. So you for real will want to get out a pen and paper and take some notes. It's jam-packed full. I hope you guys enjoy. Corey Ray Evans is an adjunct professor of Africana Studies at the University of Northern Colorado and instructor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies in the Center for Women's Studies and Gender Research at Colorado State University. They received their MA in Ethnic Studies and a Master's Certificate in Gender, Power, and Difference from Colorado State University. Their research and writing seeks to illuminate the ways that both dominant and marginalized populations are impacted by supremacist ideologies and historical trauma. Their current research project is dedicated to developing a decolonial feminist pedagogy that de-emphasizes the significance of Eurocentric systems of knowing and constructing knowledge in order to provide educators with critical approaches to challenging supremacist ideologies and the interlocking systems of oppression that sustain them within the neoliberal academy. Further emphasis is placed on utilizing women of color feminist practices such as self-reflexivity to facilitate anti-racism training and the dismantling of interlocking systems of oppression within the self through providing opportunities for students to develop deeper understandings of their own relationships to power and how they are impacted by these systems as a mode of working towards social healing. Well, damn. Thank you, Corey, for sharing with us today and holding space.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about consent today.
Me too. So before we get started, can we just go over what pronouns we use and our race or ethnicity we embody? So I'll go first. I'm Goddess, and I am a Black-bodied individual. Oh, and these they, them, their pronouns.
My name is Corey Evans. The pronouns that I use publicly are they, them, theirs, although I don't really have a preference for pronouns. I just use that as a way of getting people to kind of think outside of the gender binary. And I am Black and white biracial, and I identify as Black.
Thank you. And then for our check-in in this moment, how do you feel in your body?
Right now in this moment, I feel pretty good. I feel energized. Initially, I was feeling a little bit tired. I'm sure other people are also feeling the impacts of the quarantine on sleep habits. But like I said, I'm really excited to talk about consent, and so I'm feeling pretty energized right now.
Woo! Well, I will take some of that energy. I'm feeling calm, but I just got done with the Queering Spirituality Summit that I and another organizer co-hosted, and I'm pretty zonked. So this is going to be um, a beautiful conversation, and afterward I will be taking a very long nap before going to work.
I
So
feel that.
yeah, I'm 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 very excited for this conversation though, and to hear what you have, your thoughts on all the questions. So yeah, um, so with your background, I think that this first question is going to be really important. Um, due to your perspective, but what is consent as we know it, and how can we introduce it into um, our like everyday way of thinking?
So consent is a clear agreement, and it has to be a clearly communicated agreement that is made between participants who are engaging in specific either sexual and also non-sexual activities that range from asking someone permission for a hug or non-sexual touch to asking someone to engage in sexual intercourse. Consent can be actively communicated either verbally or non-verbally, and this really depends on the participant's primary modes of communication. You know, some folks are non-verbal and may utilize American Sign Language. They may sign, for example, instead of using verbal communication. As long as it is clearly communicated, that becomes really important. Consent can be given or rescinded at any time. It doesn't matter if participants are in the middle of a sexual act. After they have already provided consent to engage in the sexual act, they can say, you know what, never mind. I'm no longer interested in this. I would like to stop. They can decide that they no longer want to participate in that act, and that boundary must be respected by all participants who are involved in the activity. Just because consent has been given by participants in the past doesn't mean that consent is always a given. So, you know, I could be in a married relationship. We've been married for 10 years. We have a healthy sexual relationship. Just because I said yes last week and the day before that and the day before that, that doesn't mean that tomorrow I'm going to say yes. It fluctuates, you know. I might want to have sex one day, but not the other. So it has to be given every single time. Individuals can change their mind from one interaction to the next during the middle of an interaction, whether that be sexual or non-sexual activity, even if they've given consent to participate in it beforehand. So consenting to one activity is not giving consent to participate in new or future activities. So, for example, if a couple is engaging and they agree to engage in sexual intercourse, maybe they have agreed to engage in oral sex. Just because someone has given consent to engage in oral sex, that does not mean that they're giving consent to penetration, for example. So you need to get consent for each new activity as well. Consent is not something that can be implied, whether someone is being silent, for example. No, you know, there's an absence of a no. That is not consent. Only a clearly communicated yes provided by all participants involved is adequate consent. I'm going to bed, for example, is not an invitation. You know, whereas, do you want to come to bed with me? You know, would you like to sleep together or have sexual intercourse? You know, there's no reading between the lines. It has to be clearly communicated, you know, explicitly clear communication that indicates consent. And specific relationship dynamics are not consent again. So there might be a married couple who's been together for over a decade. Just because they've been together for an extended period of time, or because they're married or in a romantic partnership, that does not constitute consent. And being in a relationship with another person does not give you entitlement to their bodies in any circumstances whatsoever, unless they, again, have given you explicit consent to act on their behalf. One kind of counterexample would be in the case of medical emergencies. You might have a spouse who you've given permission to act on your behalf in the case of medical emergencies. But outside of that, it has to be given in the moment every time. And it's important to understand that underage individuals, and understanding that the definition of underage, even within the United States, varies state to state. So in the United States, underage can mean anywhere between 15 and 18, though for the sake of this conversation, I mean 18 years old as being a consenting adult, and anyone under the age of 18 being underage. Underage individuals cannot provide consent. Individuals who are intoxicated cannot provide consent. And providing consent prior to becoming intoxicated is not the same as consent. I've really kind of made this point salient in my classroom, and students had a really hard time grappling with the fact that you cannot utilize alcohol, you cannot utilize substances and engage in sexual relationships. It doesn't matter if you kind of talked about having sex before you started drinking alcohol, for example. Once you're intoxicated, once you're inebriated, you're in a different state of mind than you were when you were sober and provided consent, and so it is no longer valid. Individuals who are sleeping or unconscious, that includes being blackout drunk, because again, people might say, well, you're conscious, right? No, technically you're not, you're unconscious. You're not aware of your surroundings, you're not able to kind of take in the external stimuli and make informed decisions, and therefore you cannot give consent. Individuals who are misinformed or manipulated into having intercourse under false pretenses also cannot provide consent because they're not entirely aware of what they're consenting to. So this can include cases of individuals not disclosing, for example, that they have an STD or have an STI prior to engaging in sexual intercourse. So if they have not disclosed all of the information, then their partners do not know what they are consenting to, which would be making themselves vulnerable to getting STIs or STDs. And that is a form of abuse. So obviously there's no consent in that situation. And to your second question, I know that was kind of a lot with the definition, but to your second question of how we can kind of introduce this into our everyday ways of thinking, and this is a question that I would like to kind of address throughout our conversation as the context kind of varies, but I think that conversations about consent should really begin as early as possible because our understandings of consent begin developing in the home, in platonic relationships. So I think that parents have a responsibility to teach their children about consent young. Because what happens is young children, when they're not having those conversations in the home, when there aren't adequate comprehensive sex education programs available, they seek out pornography. They seek out media images that perpetuate rape culture. And they seek out peer mentors who try to help educate them on who they are as sexual beings growing up. And that happens in gendered ways that lead to kind of the blurring or the minimizing of boundaries, the misunderstandings and miscommunications. And I'd like to say more about this point as I kind of unpack how we get socialized as sexual beings in the United States. But going back to that point about these platonic relationships in the household, with children thinking back, I think for many of us we can reflect back on parents kind of doing the whole, well, give your mom a hug and a kiss, right? Give your Uncle Joe a hug and a kiss. Go and sit in that family member's lap. Even taking children to the grocery store, right? Go and sit on Santa's lap, right? This is a stranger we don't know. The parents don't know. The caregivers don't know. But you're expected to go and have some type of a physical interaction with them that might not be comfortable. So at a very young age, right, outside of the context of sexual relationships, especially for young girls, what the messages that they are receiving are is that their bodies are not their own. I'm sure many folks have probably also heard, you can do what you want with your body when you aren't under my roof. So again, the message is that your body is not your own. You don't have agency. You don't have bodily autonomy as an individual, right? And more so that you are an object, right? You are under control of whoever that authority figure is in the household. And so when they then branch out later on in life, they're seeking out those authority figures, right, who are kind of shaping, again, the ways that they move in the world, the ways that they understand their bodies, they understand themselves as sexual beings, and how their bodies then become vulnerable to being manipulated by other people and dominated by other people in really abusive ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanna unpack some of the things that you were saying because it seems like there's a common one of the things that really stuck out to me is this idea that we do not have from a very young age, from birth, we are taught that we don't own our own bodies. And so it disconnects us from, first of all, connecting with what we are feeling within our own bodies, but then disconnects us from feeling into like what are going on with other people's bodies and kind of gauging and there's it's a huge disconnect, which is why consent, like actually getting a clear yes, is so important because we've kind of been raised to not tap into that, not tap into what we are feeling in the moment, what others are feeling.
Absolutely. And I want to talk about this, especially as we kind of talk about the impacts of trauma, but sometimes what happens for some people is that they dissociate, and with dissociation, it's all about, like you said, that disconnect. disconnecting from, again, taking in that external stimuli, your surroundings, your environment, being unable to connect with your thoughts, with your feelings, being unable to connect with your physical body and the sensations that might be telling you, hey, I don't feel comfortable. I'm seizing up. I'm having a hard time breathing. My body is tensing up. Maybe that's telling me that I'm uncomfortable. It's a complete disconnect from the body. It's kind of like having an out-of-body experience. And so that makes it really challenging for those individuals, when they're not feeling comfortable in the interaction, to speak up and say, hey, actually, I don't feel comfortable doing this. And you kind of hear that narrative a lot of, why in this situation didn't I do something? Why couldn't I act? Why couldn't I say something? I know better. I know what to say. I know what to do. But in the moment, I just froze up. And so, as you were saying, it becomes really important not only to be kind of aware of your own body, but your partner's as well, because they may be giving you nonverbal cues that say, I don't feel comfortable. I don't consent to this interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, okay. So I have, because it's not just freeze that people can do, but we can also, in trying to regain control of our own bodies, we can actually become the people who are ignoring the needs of others. And there's a quote that I wanted to share with you and get your thoughts on, from the zine Learning Good Consent, that says, in this one person's experience, they said, I generally initiated when I thought someone wanted it so that I wouldn't have to try and say no and then be raped, even though this boy would have never even ever raped me. And I knew that. So look, the idea of, okay, so we're being raised to think that someone else owns our bodies. And then when we become adults, we realize that we now are given the opportunity to take control of our bodies, but we don't have the skills to actually, in the act of taking control of our bodies, do it in healthy ways. So then we end up perpetuating this kind of dominion or like rulership that is very blind and ends up kind of bulldozing over other people. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think that this kind of way we're being trained in society, um, do you think that this is like a global issue, or is this just like a Western issue?
So I think that it's both a Western issue and a global issue, but I think obviously the cultural contexts are going to be really important. And so you're touching on a lot of different things here, and I want to kind of start by talking about, as you were mentioning, how we get socialized as sexual beings, because that kind of helps us to understand what's kind of happening. And we understand it's happening in gendered ways, and what that means is, we're talking about patriarchy here. Patriarchy is all about male domination, male control, centering male perspectives. And I want to be very clear, when I use male here, I don't mean biologically male. This is kind of a flaw in our language. We use the term male in many cases as if it is interchangeable with man, and of course it's not. And so what I'm really talking about here is cisgender men when I'm talking about who is that dominant group. But what happens is it's all about centering on their perspectives, their control, their domination. And so even though it benefits men, I want to be very clear that not only men participate in it, we can all internalize patriarchy and we can all embody it. So as you're saying, with the fact that even for folks who are victimized, right, even folks who are survivors, they can turn around then and engage in similar ways where they are not honoring other people's boundaries. They're not being mindful of what makes other people feel safe. They want to control and kind of dominate the progression of the sexual activities in ways that make them feel empowered and in control, because there were situations where they felt like they did not have that control. It was taken from them. And so I want to start by just talking about how we get socialized in gendered ways to help contextualize what's happening, and then how we all can embody these very behaviors, so for all of us to be mindful of. So what happens, first of all, it becomes really important to discuss consent, because we can't talk about consent without illuminating rape culture and the way that we normalize sexual violence against women's bodies. And not only women, but folks who are marked as being feminine or femme. So that's anyone who is not fitting within what we call heteronormativity. And heteronormativity reinforces a lot of binaries. It reinforces this binary that there are only two biological sexes, male and female, so the race is intersex people. It reinforces this idea that there are only cisgender men and women, or the race is trans people, non-binary people, and the assumption is that we are all necessarily heterosexual. So that becomes important context, and that's being reinforced by this rape culture. So we're normalizing sexual violence against all bodies that are not cisgender heterosexual men's bodies. And we do this systemically, so through our cultural practices. That includes misogynistic social norms, victim blaming, particular rape myths. So a rape myth, for example, would be that marital rape doesn't exist, right? If you're married, that means that you necessarily want it. Well, that's not true, right? Marital rape is an issue. There's the sexual objectification of women as well. And so we're objectifying women's bodies as sexual objects. Or again, the feminine being anybody who's not that cisgender heterosexual man. And what we do is we position them as sexual objects that are only there to serve the desires and the sexual desires of men. And so what happens is this empowers boys and men to feel a sense of entitlement to women's bodies due to the ways that they are socialized into believing that, for example, merely desiring sex is enough to ensure that it's going to happen, because they are socialized into understanding themselves as being kind of active participants, where they see the feminine, the female, the woman in the situation as being a passive participant. The one piece of that again kind of fuels the abuse is that we are all socialized into understanding the use of substances such as alcohol as conduits to quote unquote getting some, right? That's the narrative. I need to get some. This becomes a loosening agent that can loosen up women and kind of get what I want, you know. Maybe they won't be as hesitant, or their inhibitions will kind of melt away, right, if we use these substances. Which again, there's no consent in being intoxicated. And so boys and men also understand themselves as being active in initiating the sexual interaction, controlling the direction, the flow of the sexual interaction. And again, they perceive their feminine partner, whoever that may be, as being passive and therefore passively acted upon, right? They're objects to be passively acted upon. And unfortunately, on the other side of things for girls and women, and especially through the use of pornography and other other parts of the sex industry, what ends up happening is girls internalize the message that they are passive objects that should accommodate male pornographic fantasies, that don't accommodate their own boundaries. So even if they feel uncomfortable doing something, because they're being pressured into doing it, they saw it in this video, and probably in several videos, right, because this is normalized, these images that degrade women, humiliate women, perpetuate harm and violence against their bodies are normalized. And so women bypass their own boundaries, their own comfort, in order to accommodate these sexual desires of men. So that becomes another part of the issue as well. And this is not only sexualizing women, but children, girls and women. And so girls are socialized to be attracted to sexually aggressive boys, or boys who are not, over boys who are not aggressive, reinforcing this idea of toxic masculinity, this traditional form of masculinity as being dominant and superior and desirable. And so what happens with girls and women is we're placed into what's called this Madonna whore binary, where you're either the prude, right, and you're being shamed for not having sex, or you're a slut and you're shamed for having sex. Whereas for boys and men, they're placed into what's called the stud-husband dichotomy, where they're either the bad boy, right, they're sexually aggressive and desirable, we want that, right? And that's kind of a contradiction in the construction of the perfect man, right? He's bad, he's aggressive, somewhat violent, right? But he's supposed to also be good to you somehow. But on the other side of this dichotomy, we have the man who is too sweet. And because he's too sweet, he's marked more feminine, he's being less masculine, and therefore less desirable. And so we're oversimplifying and distorting the complexities of gender and sexuality by creating this gender bias. And so we minimize sexual violence against girls and women because, again, we've normalized these images. We block healthy affirmations of human sexuality. And then we have people with non-traditional sexual and gender roles because, again, we're assuming, cisgender men and women who are heterosexual, and we leave everybody else out. So that's another piece.
Oh, sorry. I just because some of the words that you brought up kind of triggered some things in me. So when you talk about like passiveness and how women are trained to kind of be these passive, docile creatures in the act of sex or just in general, when we remove like someone who is presenting as masculine or assists in any, like, when we remove a man from the situation, what you're saying still shows up. When we think of like the idea, when you said stud, I immediately went to in Black lesbian culture, the role of a stud. There's been documentaries on it, on like how there are these very aggressive, hyper masculinized females who can be, honestly, in my perspective, some of the traits that were seen as ideal, like, and wanted in a partner, were very toxic. And the ideal like pairing for that was a very docile, very femme presenting person. Like if you had two studs together, that was seen as being too gay. And so when we even remove someone who doesn't identify as a male, this is still being perpetuated. And I think it's important to bring that out, and how it can play into when that's removed, how it can still be those feelings and that trauma and that learned behavior can still be experienced. And then what do we do with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. This is something I think about a lot, and that's exactly what I'm getting at with saying that anybody can internalize patriarchy and embody it, even though not everyone benefits from it. So, for example, with the stud lesbians, they're not going to benefit from participating in kind of performing in ways that are masculine necessarily, because they're marked as feminine because of their, again, biological sex and the expectations put onto them. But what they are doing is internalizing patriarchy and embodying that. And one thing that I've noticed growing up queer, so I grew up in Colorado. And Colorado is a very heteronormative space, and it makes it very hard to unpack queerness in healthy ways growing up. And so what you're speaking to, I've actually experienced quite a bit, and I've actually been really surprised kind of coming to this realization that in same-sex couplings, the same dynamic occurs almost to the same extent. And it happens in an interesting way, though. So let me explain kind of what I've seen, and I would love to hear what you've seen as well. So, within this heteronormative dynamic, what happens is you have men who are engaging in this narrative of no homo, right? I'm not gay, and going out of their way to prove that they are heterosexual. But for women, the narrative was very different. For women, it was, well, we're all girls here, right? I've seen a naked woman. I've seen a naked female body. I have a naked female body. I don't feel uncomfortable. I'm in tune with my sexuality. I feel grounded in my sexuality, healthy in my sexuality, that I don't need to kind of prove that I'm not queer necessarily. But what would end up happening? So there was this kind of performance of heterosexuality happening to a degree. And it was being kind of written off in that way, right? Well, I feel comfortable around other women. But what ends up happening is, now we have these friends, these girlfriends who are not in a romantic or a sexual partnership. But again, that same kind of dynamic happens where whether or not they present as male, perform masculinity, that same dynamic of feeling entitled to women's bodies occurs. That becomes really interesting. And even if we take women out of the dynamic, let's say that we're looking at men, right, and we're looking at gay couples, we could go to pornography as well, right, and we see particular things happen with the language and the ways that we explain the body, which become really interesting. So, for example, all of a sudden, we're still upholding that dynamic, right, of which one is the male, which one's the female in the dynamic, right, which one's masculine or feminine, and it's all about dominating, right. So we have the conversations about who's the top, who's the bottom, right. The bottom is the one who's being dominated, being controlled. The top is the one in control, the one who dominates the body of the feminine, who we would assume to be the one who is the bottom. And looking at pornography, then they use language like, oh, I'm going to tear apart this boy pussy, right? They use that language that marks particular bodies as feminine. So even though we're looking at different bodies, that dynamic that's kind of associated with the physical body is still showing up in these same-sex dynamics as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. Like in my own experiences with having sex with men, cis women, trans folks, like there's this point where consent. I'm checking in at different points, and there's a moment when I'm in a sexual experience, like having sex with a woman, where I feel like there's this point where I see the act, like the taut act of leaving happen, and they disconnect. and they turn into this very like docile, passive creature. And it throws me off because I'm like, wait a second. I was just like, with a being, and like we were here together, and then you left. And I think it's a taught act, because I notice I do it when I'm having sex with men, and that's not just cis men. Like I turn into this, well, like I'm just gonna like lay here kind of point, or like I'm just going to, I don't know how to describe it, but it's a very like it's a protective act, but it's also what we've been taught to view as like what should happen during sex. And it throws me off because I'm not presenting, like I'm not a man. And so it throws me off because I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this? This is not what I even consented to. And it runs so deep within our behavior systems that I think out of fear of having the conversation around it within the queer community, and out of fear of being like said to be, a pervert, or like, well, did you do this to this person? We don't have those conversations. So it remains silent, and it keeps going on and on and on. Even on CrashPad, I see these behaviors, and it makes me really uncomfortable because I'm going to, these sites with like the hopes of like, I'll finally see the act of sex like in a way that is not like really triggering for me and like discomforting, and it was like, real, and it's not the case.
Absolutely. And I think, like you're saying, it's so frustrating how quickly we can kind of fall back into the ways that we've been socialized over time. And the thing is, we're constantly surrounded by these pornographic images, and they're not all coming from pornography, right? I mean, I'm sure, just off the top of my head here, thinking about that Paris Hilton, like Whopper commercial, she was on a car in a swimsuit, washing the car, right, throwing her body all over it. So we see these pornographic images all over the place, and advertising is a big hot spot for objectifying women's bodies as sexual objects. And that's kind of, again, where we kind of default back into some of those images where we see women's bodies as being passive. We're not moving, right? Usually you don't see the full woman's body anyway, right? It's usually like a headless or a necklace, bits and parts of the body. You see the torso, you see the legs, but it's fragmented in particular ways. And I think I kind of like thinking about it in that way, because that's kind of what's happening with what you're talking about, right? I feel like, and in my own experiences, I don't want to speak for your experiences, but I've noticed my own kind of fragmentation and falling back into those ways that we've been socialized to perform for the male gaze, to demonstrate that we are docile, as you were saying. I'm here to just, be controlled, be dominated, to follow the lead of authority. We're so used to these like paternalistic types of relationships that are all about control and domination, that it's very easy to default back into that. We really don't have healthy models of relationships or communication. I think now we're, especially as healing justice is becoming kind of a larger conversation and is a kind of a developing field, we're starting to have more healthy models of communication. People are more turned on to therapy, trauma-informed therapy and things. And so I think we are kind of starting to be able to work through that. But because we have all of these images that are still normalizing the degradation of women, and femme folks, and their bodies, and humiliating them, seeing them as docile, passive objects, is very hard not to internalize and kind of put on that performance, because we've been taught our entire lives to put on that performance. And even as we read all of the books and educate ourselves on these systems, it's like second nature, and you kind of engage in the performance, and then you stop and you look back and you're like, wait a minute, why was I doing that? Why was I acting from this space? Why was I performing femininity in these really unhealthy ways?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's hard to honestly go back and look at your history and noticing where you were the perpetrator, you were the one being perpetrated on. Like, it's not black and white. There's so many gray areas. But in order to show up better for yourself and for your future partners, you need to do that. It's just so necessary. It's so necessary.
Absolutely. Yeah. Self-reflexivity practices are so central, and that's what really becomes important. You can unlearn and unlearn. For example, we talk about, hey guys, we use that as a kind of way of addressing an entire room of people regardless of their gender. And we're normalizing men, right? And centering men. And even as you learn that that's not appropriate, you hear someone else say it, and all of a sudden it's back in your vernacular. And so self-reflexivity is all about kind of reflecting back on your thought processes, on particular ideologies that you hold, on particular behaviors and actions that you've taken on, and really unpacking, well, where does this come from? Where did I learn these ideas? What makes me think that this is okay? Who constructed this narrative? Who does this narrative benefit? Those types of questions become really important. And I think sometimes knowing what questions to ask becomes kind of the challenge because, again, it's an unlearning process. We've been taught all of these different myths. And now we have to kind of unpack them. And it's a continuous life process of continuously unpacking over and over again. Because like you said, it is a gray area, right? In many cases, we are not being mindful of, and don't even know how to name our own boundaries, let alone being mindful of other people's boundaries and how we might be crossing them. And so I think that becomes a really important process along with that open communication to ensure that you're being very mindful of how you're kind of showing up in the world, how you're perceiving yourself as a sexual being, your sexual partners, how you engage with them and interact with them, and unpacking kind of what your arousal is rooted in. Is it rooted in the degradation and violence against women's bodies and femme bodies, or is it coming from a healthier space where we're validating everyone's right to sexual pleasure?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And those gray areas aren't a reason to not look at things, and they're not a reason to justify the behavior. If someone comes to you and says, you did this, it's not an excuse. The gray area is what we need to look at and not what we need to ignore.
Absolutely. And I think you're really speaking as well to gaslighting and how prominent that is for women and girls. And anyone who has been victimized, anyone who is a survivor, because we could be talking about cisgender heterosexual men as well. Carrie Cruz, for example, was a survivor of sexual assault that was also invalidated. And so we have to think about how we gaslight people and we make people question. So just because we had a different version of reality, I experienced this moment in this way, but you experienced it in that way. If you said you feel uncomfortable and I did something to make you feel that way, it's not my place to say, no, I didn't. That becomes a moment for accountability. And you can never tell someone else how you have made them feel, right? It's for them to articulate and for you then to unpack that, right? Figure out kind of how were you showing up? Again, where were those ideologies kind of rooted in? How do you work to unpack those behaviors to ensure that you don't commit harm against someone again? How can you be mindful of the future? So I think that becomes really important as well, is that gaslighting dynamic comes up where people are then taught to, their experiences are invalidated and they're taught to question their experiences and their own realities of these situations, which can then lead to further victimization in the future, especially if someone's kind of weaponizing that against someone who has been a survivor of sexual assault.
Yeah. And that segues me into this question of like, can perpetrators and survivors, like, are they mutually exclusive terms or roles, if we want to call it that? Like, why or why not would that be?
Yeah, so perpetrators and survivors definitely are not contradictory categories. Someone can be both. And I think that R. Kelly is a good example of someone who is both a survivor and a perpetrator of sexual violence. So for folks who might not know his backstory, he was sexually assaulted as a child by a member of his extended family. And so again, when I bring up that example of, go sit on Uncle Joe's lap, unfortunately, in many cases, we know the perpetrator of violence. We know who has caused us harm. And so for these children, they're in a position where they're very vulnerable to violence at the hands of grown adults. And so he was a survivor, right? He was victimized as a child. And we can empathize, and we should empathize with that. However, despite experiencing that sexual trauma, what happened was he then had this extensive history of grooming and preying on underage girls and women and young women, and especially girls and women of color, who tend to be more vulnerable to sexual violence and and state violence, right, which makes it a lot more difficult for them to seek justice for these situations. It's already very difficult 98% of perpetrators of sexual violence go free. And so with that being said, imagine then compounding that with the racial piece as well, right? The racism, the racial discrimination, the racial trauma that comes into these sexual interactions, which is really important, especially when we're talking about Black and Native women. But we have to understand that individuals can exist at the intersection of both being a survivor and a perpetrator of sexual violence. And what happens is that illuminates, first of all, our complexities. Like you were saying, it's not this kind of black and white, right? There's not this clear cut, you are the perpetrator of violence, these people are merely victims. We can be both, and in many times, especially because we don't have these conversations about consent, we're not well informed, we're not engaging in healthy and safe ways. It's very likely that many of us are engaging or are kind of existing at the intersections of both. And so that helps illuminate our complexities and helps us to figure out what do we need to work on. And it disrupts these kind of dualistic ways of understanding victimization. So we like to think of victimization as being a distinctly feminine experience, which it's not, right? As we talked about, Terry Crews has been a survivor of sexual assault. He is read as masculine, right? He presents as masculine and identifies as a man and as masculine. And committing sexual violence is not a distinctly masculine behavior, right? There are people who are feminine, who are femme, who also engage in sexual violence as well, and against people who are read as masculine. So that kind of flips that or kind of disrupts that dynamic where we see, again, the masculine as being this dominating active force that's acting upon the passive feminine. Another thing that happens, so obviously we need to understand cis women, transgender men and women, non-binary folks are capable of engaging in sexual assault, even though they are more likely to be sexually assaulted. These are the folks that are most vulnerable and experience the highest rates of sexual assault. But they can also be perpetrators. And cisgender heterosexual men can be victims of sexual assault, even though they tend to be a majority of the perpetrators. So these understandings help to disrupt these kind of binary gender roles because our understandings of masculinity tend to be rooted in domination, right? And our understandings of femininity are rooted in victimization. But then we can kind of understand that masculinity and femininity are rather two separate poles. It is a spectrum, and we can kind of fall within, anywhere on that spectrum. We can embody both masculine and feminine characteristics and traits. And that becomes really important to note. That helps us get away from marking particular bodies as merely as a feminine or masculine. It kind of helps to break open those binaries. And I think that's really important.
So because we are the most vulnerable, would you say that the experiences, we probably have more experiences of this behavior being put on us or like forced upon us? And that might be a part of the reason why regaining our autonomy or control can kind of look like perpetuating that idea. And I'm not saying that in a way like it's clear that like all queer folk will be perpetuating this and like it's going to be there. But it is something to look at it of like, how are we reclaiming our bodies?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that reclaiming a sense of control in the situation over these sexual interactions can feel probably very empowering for some individuals. And I think that that's why you see people like R. Kelly who were survivors, because in a lot of cases we would think, well, he's a survivor. You would think that he would be able to empathize with people who have been through the same situation. However, especially being a child who is vulnerable, you look to authority figures to keep you safe and protected, to have safe attachments to, and that was disruptive for him. And so he doesn't really have this safe way of navigating relationships, navigating the world around him. And so he's engaged in ways that are unhealthy, unsafe, and are all about, again, I think reclaiming control as a way of kind of keeping his body safe, keeping himself safe, or at least a sense of safety, what might feel like safety to him, even though, again, there's that lack of recognition or willingness to reflect on how he has been infringing upon other people's boundaries. And just engaging in sexual violence, right? Because in many cases, he is picking up on underage girls as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's almost like this going to an extreme of like perpetuating the same thing, but in a different extreme. So like being overly, in some dynamics I've been in romantically, it seemed like there was like an overprotection based off of like their past traumas of like their own bodies being violated, and knowing that my body was being was violated at one point. Like this overprotection that turns very patriarchal and like patronizing. And then on my end, there was like this over motherliness that turned into what I'm thinking of the word. What's the like taking on way more of what they were going through than what I needed to, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Like, yeah. Oh, I can't think of the dynamic. It's like when the relationships where you know what I'm talking about? Like codependent.
Okay.
Dependent. There we go. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. Codependency. Yeah.
Absolutely. I agree. And I think I was thinking of the word paternalism as you were kind of saying that.
Oh, yes.
And paternalism does that, right? It's about making whoever that oppressed group is dependent on you for survival. This kind of narrative that, you know, without me as this authority figure, as the one who is literally controlling the lives, the bodies, and the destinies of these other individuals, without me doing that and playing that role, they will not be safe. They will not be protected. Their needs won't be met. And that's the narrative. I mean, that's never actually kind of rooted in perceptions, right? And this is kind of a colonial way of understanding things, right? When we're talking about colonizing the land. And so it's not actually about legitimate care for someone else, because legitimate care obviously has to do with understanding what other people desire, what other people need, what makes them feel safe, unsafe, what makes them feel comfortable. And we're completely decentering those individuals in the dynamic. And as you said, like with that kind of maternal, or how I'm thinking of it, a paternal type of care, it's like, well, you don't get to name what makes you feel safe, what makes you feel comfortable. You know, you don't get to be the one in control of your own destiny. It's for me to decide, right? And for me to kind of take on. So it's almost like this hyper control over keeping one's own body safe, but also almost kind of engaging in doing that to other people, which is really interesting. And I don't know if it's so much for the sense of protecting their bodies, but again, controlling their bodies in such ways that they won't be able to cause your body physical harm.
Yeah. Maybe that I'm thinking of protection, but it does seem a lot more like control under the guise of protection, which are two very different things.
Absolutely. And you see that sometimes where people kind of conceptualize control as a form of love, because they don't know what love looks like. So when I was growing up, for example, I thought that discipline was love. I thought, oh, I just need more, you know, I grew up in dealing with childhood emotional neglect. And so I was like, oh, I need more discipline, right? Instead of thinking of, oh, I need affection. I need someone to ask me how I'm doing, to communicate with me about my emotions when something's going wrong. Not to lash out and then kind of pretend the situation didn't happen. And so we have like these ways of conflating, again, paternalistic types of care, which is not real care, not real love, with being loved, because we're so used to those models of control. It's all about authority, and that comes from the household too, right? The parents are the authority figures, especially the father. You listen to them. You don't get to speak and say your piece, right? You're objectified and dehumanized in that way. And I think that dynamic is kind of coming up as well, where we're dehumanizing other people. You don't get to speak for yourself. You don't get to name what you're going through, your experiences, what your needs are. I'm going to decide that for you and treat you like an object and property, right? So I think that's another part of the dynamic as well.
Mm-hmm. So being both Black-bodied people, I think that this is internalized on multiple levels. So when we bring race into this, you mentioned before BIPOC people, especially being kind of controlled or groomed in a certain way to perpetuate these this dominant power. How can consent look different across like racial and ethnic lines and intersections? And do we need to consider that when engaging in romantic intimacy with people that might be, if we're BIPOC, maybe they're the same ethnicity as us, or if it's a different ethnicity than us?
Yeah, so I think that we do need to consider those differences when they come up, and I do think that it's really important to understand the implications of what those power differences mean. And so I do want to backtrack really quickly before I get to that and just unpack, for example, why we see higher rates of sexual violence against, especially Black and Indigenous women, especially Indigenous women. Because that, again, kind of helps to illuminate some of the issues here. And it kind of touched on your question earlier about how this is a global issue as well. And so rape culture happens, outside of the context of the United States. But if we're looking at our own influence in other nations, I think it's really important to kind of think about the role of U.S. colonialism and imperialism as it relates to sexual violence against women of color, both here in the United States and also in what we like to call third world nations. I don't like using that language because it reinforces kind of binary, right? Third world, first world, underdeveloped, overdeveloped, developed, when what's actually happening is these are heavily exploited nations, right, that have been harmed and abused. They're colonized peoples. And so we need to kind of keep that context in the forefront of our minds. There's this really great book by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz called An Indigenous People's History of the United States. And it talks about military approaches to colonizing, what is now known as the United States, and the fact that those kind of approaches to colonizing this land were used to inform imperial ventures elsewhere. And so what happens through this context is we are feminizing the land. And this is going to be important when we're talking about kind of global power dynamics here. So especially folks who are coming from Western nations, right, this is what we benefit from. And so we feminize the land and its inhabitants, and the military is marked as masculine. So again, the land is passive and to be acted upon. The people are to be acted upon, but the military is active. They act upon. They are the authority. They are kind of ruling. They are in control. They are dominating. And so the idea is that to penetrate the Native woman's body is to penetrate the land, because in pre-colonial matriarchal societies, women have been the purveyors of cultural knowledge. They've been leaders in their community. And again, and so when I say matriarchy, it's very different than patriarchy. It's not about control. It's not about domination. It's about communal organizing, essentially. It's about being in community with each other. It's about understanding yourself as belonging to a larger collective, right? You're one piece of the whole. You're kind of breaking away from these ideas of individualism and just thinking about yourself and thinking about and caring for others as well. And so it becomes a way of destabilizing cultural communities and forms of cultural resistance against, again, colonialism and imperialism. And so this legacy of sexual violence can be seen, in the Philippines. We can look at Japan. We can look at Iraq. There was the torture back in 2003. There was the torture of Iraqi prisoners in Abu Ghraib. And that really kind of informs these power dynamics that are happening on a global level. So we have the West that is marked as masculine, and then we have non-Western nations that are marked as feminine. And part of the idea here, and this is historically justifying colonization of indigenous peoples, this is justifying slavery, right, and the transatlantic slave trade. This is part of what's called Orientalism, a framework for seeing and understanding people in the Far and Middle East, for example. So what the idea is that for anyone who is not European, who is not white, who is not in those dominant groups, we all get seen as animalistic. We get seen through this framework of savagery. We're in closer proximity to the wild, to the wilderness, and therefore more so animalistic, right? We're not human. We're less than human. We're more in tune with our bodily faculties, not our mental faculties. So we can't be reasoned with, right? And if we can't be reasoned with, the only way to kind of communicate, right, or reason with us would be through force, through physical violence. And so sexual violence, and again, many of us get seen as hypersexual. That's a part of this kind of exotic framework that happens, especially outside of the context of the United States. It is true as well for folks who are kind of racially and ethnically ambiguous, who are kind of marked as foreigners. They're seen as kind of having this sexual experience that can be kind of given to other people, right? They kind of project this racialized sexual fantasy onto people of these other. And so I think that power dynamic is really important to understand. I kind of wanted to use that to segue into talking about, so both, again, violence as we're talking about colonialism and Native women. So, even though we're not talking about the initial stages, anymore, settler colonialism continues, right? It's a structure, it's a framework, we live within it, it continues. One example of that would be the building of pipelines, right? So think about, for example, the Dakota Access Pipeline. what ends up happening, and I would encourage folks to check out Winona LaDucci, is an Indigenous scholar and activist who talks about this at length. But one of the things that she talks about is the fact that when these man camps come in, so when they're building pipelines, we have these construction sites where folks are dwelling for the time being. They're usually right off of the reservation. And what happens is these non-native settlers go onto the reservation, sexually assault Native women. And because they're on the reservation, the United States government has jurisdiction in most of those cases. It wasn't until the 2013 reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act that Native communities got a little bit more control over, those types of situations where sexual assault is occurring against women and children, Native women and children on the reservation. But because of those power dynamics between the United States government and tribal nations, we are really disempowering Native people to be able to hold perpetrators of sexual violence accountable. So that becomes really significant. We see that correlation between, again, those man camps and sexual assault against Native women. And again, the Native women going missing. Another issue that we can think about on a global scale would be sex tourism. And I like to talk about sex tourism in the Caribbean. So, for example, I talk about sex tourism in Sosuad in the Dominican. That's the capital of the Dominican Republic. And we have these Dominican women who are using, they're not able to get jobs in formal tourism industries. That would be, for example, working in the hotels, working at the resorts and things. More privileged folks have that opportunity, whereas they don't have the same access. And so they turn to informal labor, including sex tourism. And what happens is we have these European men and women who come out for weeks at a time. These are some of the poorest nations in the world. Jamaica will be another one. I think I said the Dominican Republic. They come out to these parts of the world that tend to be the poorest parts of the world, and they can spend a couple $1,000s for a 2-week vacation. And again, that's a place for them to kind of live out their racialized sexual fantasies. And so they see the Black person as the mandingo, right, who has the large penis and can, again, give them that sexual experience. Bell Hooks has a really good article, Desire and Resistance, Consuming the Other, Eating the Other, Desire and Resistance, that kind of talks about this dynamic, right? We want to consume different because of what it does. So I kind of like to compare it to cultural appropriation, kind of appropriating the body of these individuals as well. Sexually, you're consuming the bodies of these individuals sexually. And there are unequal power dynamics. These European folks have financial power that they can wield over these individuals. They have racial power, especially when we're talking about the dynamics between Black men and white women, right? Especially in the United States. We have this dynamic, and I'm sure folks are familiar with this narrative, right, where the Black man is seen as hypersexualized. He is more animalistic, that brute narrative, right? He's animalistic. He's driven by his bodily impulses. He can't control himself. He's hypersexual. He's a threat to white women, right? He's a predator preying on white women who are innocent, who are pure, who are pious, who are dependent on the protection of white men. And so just that relationship dynamic in and of itself, even if it wasn't romantic, it could be a platonic relationship. You have to be very careful of how you're moving in those relationships because you can mark, again, that Black male body in a particular way as aggressive, as animalistic, as savage, as needing to be, again, kind of dealt with, right, kind of put in their place in particular ways. So we have to understand the relationship dynamics that we're stepping into. Again, if there's a heterosexual person in a relationship with someone who is queer people especially tend to face sexual violence, right, compared to heterosexual individuals, especially if they're people of color, and especially if they're people of color who are working class or maybe facing housing insecurity. So we have to understand the nuances of our own social locations, and that would be our relationships to power, and that of our partners, because we can be in positions where we can wield power over others, where we can cause other people to be put into situations where, again, we're subjecting them to physical violence. And so I think we really need to be mindful about those dynamics that are coming up. Another dynamic when we're talking about different power dynamics and power differentials, power imbalances, is age. That's another one that we don't really talk about as much now. It used to be seen, I would argue, even 20, 30 years ago, right? We didn't really have this conversation. It was seen as more normalized for younger women in particular, girls and women, to be in relationships with grown men. And even thinking back to Roy Moore, right, and the election, people in Alabama were saying, I have a 17-year-old daughter, and I would be honored if she were to date this politician, you know? And so again, even within the United States, we're not on the same page about our definitions and understandings of what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. But I kind of alluded to grooming earlier. And in many cases, these are what we call acquaintance rapists, meaning that this is someone that the assault survivor knew, and they're targeting women who are younger. And so we could be talking about an 18-year-old. So grooming doesn't just have to happen to underage girls. I would argue if you're 19, if you're 20 years old, if the man is 50 years old, right, there's probably potential for manipulation, right? You're targeting women who are younger, more naive, more easily manipulated, as a way of kind of getting what you want, getting your way. And so you have to be mindful of those dynamics. Another situation would be when there's authority, there are particular differences in the power within an institution. So if there's someone who's an authority figure, so maybe a teacher-student relationship or a therapist-client relationship, just as a general rule, it's really not okay to engage in those relationships sexually as a general rule. There are educators and therapists who can kind of speak to the complexities, and I agree myself that I think those relationships are a little bit more complicated than that. But to be safe, I think it's a very solid rule because you, again, would have to understand the nuances of your relationship to power, their relationship to power, how power can be wielded over you and vice versa in order to keep yourself safe. And if those dynamics don't exist, I don't think it's possible for consent to be given. So yeah, I think that's especially prevalent, and it's something that we really need to talk about because we see these, for example, interracial relationships. We see people coming together over these different identities and things, and not understanding that you must be aware of who you're interacting with, how you're interacting, unpacking your own, again, preconceived biases, stereotypes. You know, are you sexualizing this person in a particular way? Are you seeing them as a means to an end? You know, we have what's called this designer baby phenomenon where white women will seek out sexual relationships with men of color solely for the purpose of having an interracial child, right? And then not being able to care for that interracial child. And so it kind of goes further, right, from that romantic relationship and stems into parenthood and so on. But I think that these dynamics in relationships are incredibly important and need to be taken seriously because otherwise, yeah, violence can absolutely occur in these dynamics.
Mm-hmm. So how can we start the conversation around consent? And maybe for the sake of like what we've been talking about, how do we start that with romantic relationships?
Yeah, so let's see. I've got a lot of responses to this question. So I think that it's really important to practice open communication at every stage of the interaction, every stage of the kind of relationship or relations. So, for example, before you interact and begin engaging in a sexual activity, it's really important to start talking about, what makes you feel comfortable? What makes you feel uncomfortable? Are there particular things that might be triggering to you? Would you happen to like if I do this, if I do that? Would you dislike it if I did this particular thing? It becomes really important to kind of understand, what your partner enjoys, what they don't like, letting them kind of name their own boundaries for you. Because what ends up happening otherwise is we kind of center our own sexual desires and our desires for the interaction, right, or our intentions for the interaction, and we end up decentering theirs. So I think it's important you definitely speak on your desires, right? Say, here is what I want to engage in with you in this moment. Here is my desire for the interaction. This is kind of how I would like it to unfold. If you don't feel comfortable with that, please let me know, and we can figure something else out, and kind of change the direction of that relationship. But it's always important to ask, right, to ask those questions. And again, we talked about the fact that not everyone feels safe communicating. Sometimes people kind of have those moments where they can't communicate for whatever reason. And so it's important to also be mindful of those, not only verbal, but nonverbal cues. So for example, if one of the partners touches someone else in a particular way and they feel their partner's body tense up or they feel them kind of shoot up all of a sudden, that might be a sign that they're not feeling comfortable, right? They're not relaxed. They've got tension for a particular reason. And so that becomes a moment to stop, take a step back, and maybe kind of interrogate what's happened, right? Maybe stop and say, do you feel comfortable? Would you like to stop? Did I do something that that hurt, that made you feel uncomfortable, that you don't want to participate in? It's really important for all of us to do this, but especially based on the ways that straight boys and men are socialized, especially them, because they benefit from it. But it's important for all of us to interrogate when our erotic desires and arousal are informed by images that erotify power, control, and sexual violence against people who are oppressed, right? Like women, transgender folks, non-binary folks, queer folks. It's really important to question how pornography shapes the ways that we see ourselves, our bodies, and our desires for intimate connections with each other. We need to understand, for example, and challenge within ourselves why, if we do see this coming up, and it's important to be honest with ourselves, right? And I want to make sure that folks understand it's not about shame. It's not about making you feel bad. You're not a bad person. I don't want you to feel guilty per se. Your feelings are valid, right? You might feel uncomfortable making this reflection, but it's really important to recognize when and where you do get turned on and aroused by pain, so you can challenge why the infliction of pain on oppressed people during sex is not an obstacle to your achieving sexual pleasure, or why it is a factor that enhances your sexual pleasure. Why are you not desensitized to images of women suffering, right, that are cruel? And there are other questions that you can think, right? You brought up codependency, and so I'd like to share some resources later on to have a couple therapists that talk about codependency in more depth that can help you think through these things. But asking questions like, is the relationship controlling or coercive? Are there ultimatums or conditions? For example, is your partner saying, well, if you don't do this for me, then I'm not going to do this for you? Or if you don't do this for me, then I'm going to do this to you, right? Making threats. Do you feel like you're being pressured when you don't feel comfortable? Do you feel like you are pressuring somebody, and whether or not you know that they might feel uncomfortable, or whether you're unsure? And if you're unsure, you always need to take a step back and ask, right? Uncertainty is never a green light, never a go ahead. Does your partner make you question your own experiences of the sexual encounters? Let's say if you have a different kind of version of experiences within a given situation. It's important that we discuss sex as integral to our humanity. We objectify sex as something that needs to be acted upon or that acts upon us, but we need to understand that sexuality is a positive part of ourselves. It's healthy. It shouldn't necessarily create shame in us. It shouldn't necessarily limit our sexual expression. And so we need to be mindful of that as well. And again, healthy sexual expressions that are not rooted in shame, that are not rooted in humiliation, coercion, causing violence against people's bodies. We need to teach boys and men that sexuality is characterized by action, control, and achievement, that it is not, characterized by action, control, and achievement. So women's bodies are not objects of sexual conquest. People's bodies are not objects of sexual conquest. They are human beings and people. We all deserve to have sexual pleasure. The idea is that, women are just there for getting men off. And again, this is within a hetero dynamic, or that they're just there to produce babies, right? That everybody is engaging in the relationship for sexual pleasure, and that should be central to these relationships and to these conversations. And we have to reflect, especially for folks who may have been engaging in crossing people's boundaries. You've got to reflect back on your own patterns. Have you ignored or suppressed verbal or physical resistance? Have you forced intercourse on someone who was semi-conscious, who was under the influence of alcohol or other substances? So those are the types of things that we have to understand. And on top of that, there are other ways that we can kind of engage in promoting healthy sexual relationships. And so we need long-term public education campaigns that are more direct, that can appeal to young audiences, meet them where they're at, focus on safety and pleasure as being central. We need to have sexual education that is folded into all school subjects at all grade levels. And as educators, it is our responsibility to provide complete and accurate information about any inquiries and about the information, right? Because especially in states like Colorado, that can be a bit more conservative. We may go towards an abstinence-only model of education that is not effective. It's just as effective as absolutely no program being implemented at all, right? And in fact, we see higher teen pregnancy rates, higher STIs and STD rates as well. Families need to have those open, honest discussions with teens about sexuality, because again, so that you want your children to engage in sex or not. They're going to do what they want to do, right? They are autonomous beings. They have the right to make choices on their own behalf. And we can't control their choices, right? But we want them to be safe when they're making these choices. So if they are going to be sexually active, there are services available, right? We should be connecting them to Planned Parenthood being a great one, to help reduce unwanted pregnancies and STDs and STIs. We need to understand that the morality of sexual behavior is measured by the values of responsibility, respect, tolerance, and equity. So again, we're all showing up, respecting each other. We are all kind of seeing each other on equal footing. We are here to care for each other, be mindful of each other's needs. We need to understand cultural diversity as well, and different cultural values as they may shape our relationships and understandings of sexuality, and so forth.
Yeah, listening to all the things that you've listed and talked about, there's so much that we're bringing into a sexual situation with us, and it's important to be very aware of those things, and not use it as a way, like as a hindrance to our connection with the other person, but as a reason to truly explore that experience and be really open and willing to talk through it, and just be in the moment, and be aware of how we're feeling and how the other person's feeling. So it's almost like more of a reason to connect during sex instead of less of reasons and like a reason to retreat or draw back.
Absolutely. I would hope that it would help empower people to feel more comfortable practicing open communication, and hopefully not only just in their sexual relationships, but I would hope that that would kind of become a way of opening them up to thinking through what open communication might look like in other relationships as well. Because as we kind of talked about, it's not only through romantic relationships that we might be crossing boundaries and kind of feeling entitled to one another, but just being in relationship with each other. We need to be able to see each other in our full humanity, all of our complexities, to embrace that, to respect and honor that, and to not, again, kind of influence our own will, our own desires onto other people. So I agree 110%. I really hope that that would open up more avenues for open communication and for stronger, more healthy relationships, right, as a result of that as well. Or maybe a way of learning, this is not a healthy relationship. I thought it was, but in trying to communicate, I came to realize that this wasn't healthy because they weren't also there. So I think that can become a way of helping us to better conceptualize what healthy communication looks like, what acts of love look like, what practices of love look like.
Yeah. One thing that you were mentioning is like asking ourselves, like, why is it that I enjoy this certain sexual interaction? Like if it involves pain or some sort of act that if it were happening outside of sex, there would usually be an issue with it, or like some type of like, oh, this isn't right. It's important to look at why we gain pleasure from certain things. Why are some things are we aroused by certain people, certain behaviors, and certain like acts? There was a podcast episode that I did with Katrina, who's a like sex educator, and she brought that up as well, of it being important that we look at those things. And I want to reiterate it. It's okay to look. It's okay to ask questions, because if we don't do that, we're kind of repressing it, and it becomes more there's more shame that we're piling on top of it, and acting that out without looking at it in sexual intercourse is very disassociating. It causes you to dehumanize yourself and the other person in that situation, and it causes them to check out. We're just perpetuating this this gap, this gulf of intimacy and connectedness within sex. And sex is a very intimate act.
Absolutely. And I think that self-reflective practice becomes really important. Because what I try to emphasize, and I have my students actually do this every week as we're kind of reading, because some of this stuff, we talk about this stuff in class, and it can be very heavy. And so I want them to I have them do a self-reflexivity exercise. And actually, let me see, there's a really good, I'm sure this has probably already come up in conversations, But there's what's called the Liberate Meditate app, and I'm sure that's already come up. It's really, really helpful, really,
Yes.
really prominent for Black, Indigenous, people of color, for queer folks. I really love the app, but there was a really good meditation on there, and I used that meditation as a framework for creating a self-reflexivity exercise for my students to check in with their bodies and figure out, okay, as I'm engaging with this information, what am I feeling? What are those feelings telling me? Am I coming from a space of judgment? Am I, and understanding that judgment is very different than valid critiques of systems of power. I want to be very clear about that, because people tend to think, oh, it's not right for me to judge Nazis. And I'm like, well, no. You holding someone accountable for engaging in white supremacist violence is very different than you judging someone for who they are as a person and making preconceived notions about who people are on the basis of these groups that they belong in. So it's really important to engage in these practices. And let's say you do get aroused by an image of violence. Again, it's not to make you feel guilty. You shouldn't necessarily feel shame. It's not about making you feel bad. Your feelings are valid. However, you really have to unpack, and that becomes a moment of reflection, right? Rather than running away from the discomfort, that becomes a moment to check in with yourself and say, well, actually, why am I feeling this way, right? What messages happen to you that tell me that this is okay to feel aroused by looking at a woman being strangled, right? Looking at a woman being abused in these particular ways or violated in these particular ways. And that becomes an opportunity for learning and growth. And so I think conceptualizing that way is really helpful, right? It's not about shame. We're all taught these things, right? We're all indoctrinated into these systems, and we're all working through unlearning these things. And that becomes really important. We are all fallible. None of us are perfect. And I'm sure many, if not most of us, have been aroused by these images, right? Because we've been taught in society that normal and these images are everywhere. But what becomes important is unpacking why you feel that way, right? Where does it come from? How can I change my relationship with these images, right? How can I change my relationship with women and other oppressed individuals, right? Trans folks, non-binary folks, so that when I'm seeing them, I'm not kind of desiring to see them in these very abusive dynamics.
Yeah. And I love the Liberate app. So if you could share which one you're talking about, I feel like I remember listening to it, but if you could share that would be great. I'll put it in the show notes. And before we talk about what you're doing currently and some of your work, the last question is, when you dream of what healthy sexual interactions and restorative accountability looks like in the future, what do you see?
Yeah, so I think especially looking at, so there's already restorative justice happening around sexual assault, and I've been kind of getting into that a little bit recently. And it's one of those, again, gray areas, right? Because we have these systems of discipline and punishment rather than looking at how can we actually rehabilitate people, educate people, kind of create these avenues for healing. And so I think rehabilitation is really important. And trying to figure out, and I don't necessarily know what that might look like. Education is really important. There are situations with accountability procedures where the survivor does feel comfortable coming back into relationships. That's definitely not necessary. But whatever whatever the survivor needs, whatever they desire, whatever modes of healing feel, and approaches feel more comfortable to them, I think centering them 110% becomes so important, because where we're at right now, we're not doing that, right? With the Brock Turner case, for example, it became about what a bright future he had ahead of him, even though he sexually assaulted someone who was unconscious. And, they may be living with that trauma and really triggered by that for the rest of their lives. And so it's really important. And in many cases, especially on college campuses, right, those perpetrators of violence get to walk free, and that triggers the individuals who have survived. And so I think that centering the needs of survivors, creating spaces that are actually safe for them. There are programs, for example, that exist already where men will go and have conversations with each other about what is healthy, what does healthy masculinity look like? Let's unpack traditional masculinity, toxic masculinity, race culture. How do we benefit from these systems? How do we do this work to ensure that we are checking in with ourselves, with one another, and ensuring that this type of violence does not occur? I think that that's really important. Again, having open communication and honest communication about sexuality becomes really important. We have these very interesting ways of making these into taboo conversations when really this is very healthy, right? It helps us understand ourselves, our own bodies, as you were saying, it helps us to understand and think about other people as well, right? Not only our boundaries, but we can think about other people's boundaries too. And I think that's really important. Honest, proactive communication around likes, dislikes, expectations, respect for sexual expressions, as long as they're not disrespecting your boundaries, become really important. Parents, teachers, and elders needing to learn to become allies and modeling and teaching these positive values around healthy sexuality to youth is really important. Strengthening human wealth through institutional policies and practices become really important. Government allocated funding and mandates for this type of work to be possible. I think only 13 states at this point in time have, comprehensive sex education. So that should be happening on a national level, and that should be fully funded. And I think, children should have the opportunity to consent to that education without parents controlling whether or not children get that education. I think that can be extremely harmful, extremely dangerous. I think parents can consent to whether or not they also get that education because, again, it's their responsibility, right, to participate in the learning process, both educating themselves and children as well. But being a part of that process is really important to model healthy communication, healthy sexual relationships.
I'm glad you brought that out.
Around parenting relationships.
Yeah, because that's integral because it starts with, like you said at the beginning, it starts with the home. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Absolutely. It would be really great to see parents being a part of that process, rather than, again, kind of participating in the abstinence-only approach that is so harmful to kids, and just put them in a situation to not receive support, to be, uneducated, especially for queer youth, right, trans youth, not having the right tools and resources to navigate healthy sexual relationships. That becomes extremely important as well. And having more of that information, right, incorporated into, and that being a part of that comprehensive sex education, right, is having more information, more resources that cater to transgender folks. There are sex toys, for example, that cater specifically to trans folks. That could be really empowering and really important, for example, but we don't talk about those types of things. We don't talk about safe sex between couples that are not heterosexual cisgendered couples. And so that becomes important as well.
Yeah. Well, you have given us a lot of information in the span of an hour or so. And I know that there's so much more that you have to share. Can you tell us about some of the things you're currently working on and how can people hear what more of your work in the future?
Yeah, so I will share a couple of my written work, and both of them are kind of within the vein of social healing. It's something I've been exploring for like the past five years now, and it's been a process. But in one of those pieces, I'm kind of looking, as a Black person, Black feminism is very central and very important. Women of color feminisms are very important to me, and have really guided my own identity construction, my own kind of political identity and approaches. And so one of my pieces is really looking at how Black feminism provides this mode of healing. I would really recommend folks check out the Combahee River Collective. This is kind of the beginnings of Black feminism. And what's really powerful is they talk about identity politics in a way that we don't really conceptualize them today, where we're understanding that we're coming together across shared experiences, realities, common goals. And it's not so much about, well, are you in the community or not, right? And part of the understanding is if we are to center the more vulnerable members of the community, and this actually comes not only from African American, but from African systems of knowledge, that if we center the most vulnerable members of our communities, what happens is we all are liberated, right? Because, for example, Black women are queer. Black women are working class and homeless. Black women are sex workers, right? Black women are at every single kind of system of oppression, right? All of those interlocking systems of oppression. We see Black women at every intersection. Maybe not every single Black woman, right, but collectively. And so in order to liberate all Black women, we have to dismantle all structures of oppression. and that would be liberating to everybody. So using one of my pieces is looking at using that kind of framework for understanding how we can move towards healing, especially for Black women. I did another piece, and a lot of my work focuses on Black people, and it's not limited to Black people, but for the sake of kind of where I'm at and what I've been unpacking for myself. Another piece that I've done is looking at Black mixed race identity. For folks who identify as biracial and multiracial, if you've had questions around your identity, I would really recommend looking at this piece, even though it is kind of looking more so through the framework of Black identity. There are pieces in there that kind of allude to why we see monoracial communities kind of engage in this harmful identity politics, why we see people who have privilege, who are kind of at the intersections of multiple identities, why do they engage in problematic ways of engaging with their communities. That kind of stuff comes up. And again, it's about figuring out how we can move towards healing. So we have what's called disidentification theory. And what we're getting at with disidentification is that we don't want to embody, and Andre Lorde talks about this, right? We don't want to use the tools of the oppressor because, the tools of the oppressor will never dismantle the master's house, right? And so it's understanding why this happens, first and foremost, what it does to us, why we engage in it as well, and then how to get outside of that, right? How to get outside of using those oppressive ways of engaging with one another, understanding ourselves, understanding each other, the world around us, and engaging in those relationships. And then I'm actually currently working on a book as well, and this is kind of looking at assisting educators in how to think through, first of all, the academy in and of itself, right, as a space that is white supremacist, as a space that is neoliberal. It's all about turning students into consumers. So how can we see students as human beings in all of their complexities? How can we help them to engage in embodiment exercises and practices to help them understand the space that they're in, how they're navigating the space? I had mentioned that I use a particular meditation. So for folks who are familiar with the Liberate Meditate app, I use the meditation that's called Mindful of Thoughts and Emotions. And I use that format as a way of walking students through, recognizing the emotions and the feelings that come up for them in the moment. And then I have an emotion chart that they work through to identify their emotions. And then they work through, are you coming from a space of judgment or non-judgment? Investigating where these thoughts and emotions are coming from. How do their complex identities, and their relationships to power inform what's coming up for them? And how do they engage in non-attachment practices, right? How do you make note of your thoughts and emotions with the intentions of letting them go rather than kind of holding on to them in ways that are not healthy? And so I'm really focusing on healing in the classroom, but healing from these systems of power by first kind of locating our own social locations. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to get at with students in the classroom, and also having educators go through this process as well to ensure that they are not engaging in harm, right, by checking in with their relationships to power and how they embody that position.
I didn't know you were working on a book. Sorry, that made me smile so big. How can we keep up to date on when that will be dropping and we can get a copy?
Yeah, I actually will be getting a few free copies, and I would love to send you a copy. And I actually want to make sure it's as accessible as possible. And so I'm also going to be doing an e-print version as well, so that folks can access it online.
Oh, yay! Thank you. Okay. Well, when it does come out, please let me know, and I will add it to the show notes for future listeners. And congratulations! That's huge. That's huge.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And thank you for giving me a copy. I can't wait to read it. Well, thank you, Corey. This has been really informative. You touched on so much, on so many different levels of how consent is not being practiced, but also gave us like really valid and tangible ways of how we can now kind of shift that dynamic and the narrative of what we think of as survivors and perpetuators, and start to really look at that gray area. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So
Do you like me, or do you love me? Please heart the episode, share the episode, and subscribe at sunseedcommunity.com.